Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to another video. Today I figured I would go ahead and talk about my experience with the cult that I was in once upon a time. It's currently 4 o'clock in the morning, but I really want to make this video and it's been long enough. I figured out what I want to say, so here we go. It all started way back in late 2011 when my parents were looking for a new place to move into close to my grandparents, because at the time my grandparents were in their mid-80s. It was hard for them to take care of themselves. As elderly people, it's harder for them to take care of themselves, and so we started looking for places in the area to move to. That way we could help them out with living, take care of them and whatnot, and if something happened, we were pretty close by. So March of 2012, we end up packing up all of our shit from the suburb that we lived in, and we moved about an hour and a half away to the country, about half a mile from where my grandparents lived. This was a very big change, as I grew up in a suburb, and here we all of a sudden we're in country. Closest neighbor was about half a mile away, pretty close to my grandparents. So it's a pretty big change. At the time, we really didn't have any friends in the area, just family that lived in the nearest city, which is about 30 minutes away or so. So we didn't know anybody in the area. And I was raised in a Christian home, so the first thing we started doing was starting to look for a church that we could go to and attend and find some sort of fellowship in our religion. And we tried a couple of different churches, and they were just nothing unique. Just your average church, you go there, very bland, I guess you could say. Then one day, some of our neighbors, and when I say neighbors, these are people that lived like 5 miles away, a mother and her daughters came over and brought us some baked bread, welcomed us to the area, and they asked us, hey, do you want to come to our church? And we were like, sure, why not? I mean, they were very, very friendly people. They just brought us baked bread, and so we're like, cool. So we'll go ahead and go. Now, the church was called GBC. That's just an acronym for the actual name. I don't really want to give out the full name of the church just to keep them from getting harassed, like anybody's going to do that, but keep my bases covered. So we ended up going to this church, and this church was unlike what most people would ever see in their lives. This was in the woods at the pastor's farm. What you'd have to do is you'd have to drive through this really long driveway throughout the whole farm, and there's a parking area pretty much right behind the barn. And then you'd walk down these steps that he had dug into the earth down to this like a dried up stream bed, I think it was, where it kind of just went down to a creek. And that's where we had church. He had a fire pit and like tire swings and shit, and that's where this church was. So we came down there, and there's just a small group of families and whatnot, and during this particular service, there was a baptism going on. So they had a potluck afterwards, and it was just really nice and friendly, homely, The biggest thing that should have tipped off that something was weird about this church was the fact that all of the women wore skirts, and they only used the King James Version of the Bible. Those two big things right there probably should have stood out to us the most and said something about the place. But, we were new to the area. We wanted some fellowship. Well, we ended up deciding that this was the church we were going to go to. Our parents sat us down. They're like, which church do you want to go to? We're like, we want to go to GBC. That place was really cool. And so we decided that's what we were going to do. Before long, they had convinced my mother to start wearing skirts, and my mother and my father started making my sisters wear skirts. So we went ahead and kind of integrated ourselves into that culture. A few months down the line, we ended up going over to the pastor's farm because he had a pretty big farm, all organic shit, and we would go there and we started working for him for shares of his produce and whatnot, just working for food more or less. And it got to the point where we would go over there almost every day of the week, almost like a full-time job. And we were constantly interacting with the pastor. And he seemed like a cool guy, just a big, jolly fellow who would just make jokes and whatnot with me and my brother and just converse with my mom and whatnot about spiritual things, or give us, survival tips because he was a huge survivalist nut. He loved like talking about herbs and just like making shelters and whatnot. After a while, he started integrating propaganda about what Bible version that we used, showing us, wait, King James Bible is the only true Bible. All these other versions, they're not good because they've omitted verses, changed the meaning of certain words and whatnot. And so we got indoctrinated very slowly, and we were like, you know what, this actually makes sense. So we went ahead and we switched King James Version only, and then this big thing really should have tipped us off that we were crossing a line of some sort. We took all the versions of our Bibles, or the majority of them. We saved a few that weren't King James, but we took the majority of the versions that weren't King James and we fucking burned them. If that doesn't sound like cult-like behavior to you, I don't know what is. So we would take these other versions that we had saved and whatnot, and we used to make fun of them sometimes during the Wednesday night Bible studies that the pastor soon started. Now, these Wednesday night Bible studies typically involved, survival techniques that had biblical themes of some sort, which was kind of cool. But this is also where the conspiracy theories had started. About this time, we started getting indoctrinated with how the government at some point was going to take over, hence the whole survival training and whatnot. He started teaching us how to survive solely for the fact that we would have to run into the woods or whatnot to hide from the government, because in his mind, the government was going to take over and we'd become a communist nation. They'd start hunting down Christians and killing them, thus bringing in the whole prophecy of Revelation and Armageddon and shit like that. So me as a 14-year-old boy at this time was getting indoctrinated that I was going to have to run into the woods with my family and protect them from the government, because the government was going to start hunting us down and killing us. This is very problematic because I was a very impressionable young man, being 14 at the time, and that's a lot of stress to put on them. The Wednesday night Bible studies soon turned into him indoctrinating us with how to tell what a quote-unquote false flag event is, which is what he called the Boston Marathon bombing as well as the Sandy Hook shooting. At the time, I was indoctrinated to believe that these were fake things, and in years to come, I since changed my views, because why would one believe that such heinous and tragic events were faked solely for the purpose of taking away firearms from Christians? It's ludicrous. But we were heavily indoctrinated with this sort of mindset, and we started picking apart everything that we could that looked like a quote-unquote false flag event. And that's what these Wednesday night Bible studies soon became, as we were indoctrinated with what he told us. We didn't get any news from outside. It only came from the pastor. That's another big thing that should have tipped us off that this was a cult. All of our information came from one person. During this time, I also remember my family and we used to have meetings in the living room where we would write down on a whiteboard. Nobody would speak. We'd show each other the whiteboard facing it away from the TV, because we had been told that there was a camera and a microphone on our TV and that the government was watching us. And so we would have these secret meetings where we would go over a game plan of what we were supposed to do in case the government came over and was going to try to kill us. So how did we end up getting out of this cult? Well, at one point, we did him the favor of removing the carpet from his living room, which both he and his wife had expressed they wanted to remove because it was, one, incredibly dusty, and it disrupted his wife's allergies. And so we went ahead and we did this with the knowledge that he wanted it done. Well, when he ended up finding out about it, he turned it on us, calling us trespassers, stealers, and basically shunned us to the point where we were very confused as to what was going on. At this point, we started to see more interesting behaviors, such as incredibly prideful, abusive towards his wife, both mentally and emotionally. And this really disturbed us to the point where we had to distance ourselves and really analyze this man that we had looked up to so much. This man who was supposed to lead us against the government. Well, we ended up figuring out that he was not the man that we thought he was, and was in fact a lazy, heinous piece of shit. So we ended up leaving. Some of the families ended up staying, but we and the family who initially invited us to the church ended up leaving because we could no longer associate with a man such as himself. So a few years passed and whatnot. We started going to church with somebody else, and in the years that came, I started trying to think more for myself, because my entire life I'd been brought up, thinking God was watching me, my parents were watching me, people who associated with me would get disappointed. And at a certain point, I kind of started distancing myself from my religion and started taking a new look at the world around me. So I've dropped a lot of things, including my homophobia, my transphobia. Swearing is now a big thing. I used to have such a huge problem with swearing, and I came to the realization that organized religion has really done nothing but made me feel miserable. And so I left behind the traditional mindset of religion, like going to church and whatnot, and started to focus more on what I wanted to do and being in control of my own life. So that's really all I have for today. That's what my experience was like being in a cult. If you liked the video, leave a like, comment if you have a very similar experience, or if you have any other questions or whatnot. And if you like my sort of content, subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.